So the topic that I was given is Huqooq and Huqooq al-Ibaad and how to strike the balance, right? And so obviously I'm going to approach it from through a religious lens, but through the lens also of a licensed marriage and family therapist. So I do a lot of family therapy. So how do we navigate these two very important things? Our loved ones have rights over us, but more importantly, Allah has rights over us, right? And so we know in the tradition, our Prophet ﷺ taught us that لا طاعة لمخلوق في معصية الخالق, that there is no obedience to the creation if it involves disobedience to the creator. There's no obedience to the creation if it involves disobedience to the creation. If it involves disobedience to the creator, right? In another narration, it talks about, there's no pleasing the creation of Allah if it results in you displeasing Allah. So it's all well said and done, but how do we practically apply that? It's easy to apply that with people who are not related to us, right? We don't compromise on our hijab, we don't compromise on our prayer, we don't compromise on these things. But what about when it comes to dealing with our direct family members? And this is where we tend to fall into the gray and not know exactly how to navigate through. So, for example, somebody can be very firm on their principles, but then their family insists that they go to a wedding that is mixed, for example, or has certain haram elements. How do you navigate through that in a respectful manner, right? You love your children, but they're insisting on doing haram, right? How do you navigate that? I mean, it's a good start to show them the evidence of why it's haram, but that's more than likely for those of you who are parents, that's not enough. You just opening up Sahih Bukhari and showing them that this is why it's haram is not necessarily going to translate them into, them saying sami'na wa ata'na and like we listen and obey. That's usually not how it works, at least with children. That's not how the way it works with spouses, and that's certainly not the way how it works with parents. So how do we set healthy boundaries while keeping this principle in mind? And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. So it's the whole idea of setting boundaries has become like pretty much a buzzword. Like, I want to set boundaries. I have to set boundaries with this person. They're toxic. This family member's toxic. I have to set boundaries with them. The term boundaries, it really came about through a few different theorists within family therapy, and one of them is Dr. Murray Bowen, right? So he has this whole form of therapy known as Bowenian therapy. I think it is very relevant to our time, even though his theory came out in the 50s. However, we have to look at it through an Islamic lens. So we're going to be talking about two principles that he has, like setting boundaries and something known as triangulation and detriangulation, and one more is self-differentiation. And how do we use those tools while keeping this principle in mind of pleasing Allah and also making sure that we're good to the people? Because, and I'll tell you for myself, subhanAllah, I remember when I first started practicing, I was like many of us, like especially the younger brothers, ancestors, is you become very overzealous. And in that overzealousness, you remember, subhanAllah, one of my friends in college, very sincere brother, mashallah, tabarakallah. He became new to to studying the deen and so on, and he learned this issue of like, oh, I didn't realize that my cousins are not my mahram, right? Because growing up, we were taught that it's okay to hug your cousins of the opposite gender. It's okay to have khalwa, to spend time alone with them and so on. And now that I'm studying deen, I realized that there's this whole thing called mahram and not mahram. And so he said, that's it. I'm going to stay firm. And so he came to me one day and he said, Usman, like I'm really it's having such a difficult time holding on to my deen, and my family doesn't respect it. Just the other day, my aunt tried to come and hug me, and I said, no, I can't hug you. And so I looked at him. I was like, what do you mean your aunt? He's like, my mom's sister. I was like, bro, that's your khala. Go give her the biggest hug. She is your mahram, right? And he was well intended, but it was due to lack of knowledge. So he set a boundary without necessarily realizing that that's not a boundary he needed to be setting. He thought he was doing something to please Allah, but due to lack of knowledge, right? He didn't realize that his maternal aunt, his mom's sister, is his mahram. and he's absolutely allowed to hug her, and he should hug her, right? So sometimes in standing up for principles and values, we compromise other principles and values. And in saying no to our parents if they are encouraging us to do something that's displeasing to Allah, we don't want to get to a point where we're disrespectful to them, because that's also displeasing to Allah. So how do we set those healthy boundaries without compromising, what our deen says, but also doing it in a respectful manner? So setting healthy boundaries, because I know this is such a buzzword now. Like, setting healthy boundaries is not, and I repeat, not a green light to be disrespectful to others, right? One of the mistakes I would say that Bowen made is that in setting these boundaries, when he spoke about it, he writes about himself and his own conflicts within family. One of his most famous books, it's called Family Evaluation. It's a very thick, for some people, might boring book, like, because he's very philosophical in the way that he writes. But he talks about how he tried to set boundaries and started setting boundaries with his own family of origin. And his solution for a while was, close, I'm just not going to talk to anybody. That's not okay in our religion, right? So he took it a little bit extreme. And part of that is because he doesn't have the guiding light of Islam. Well, he did, he passed away, but he didn't have the guiding light of Islam to say that, yes, while you set boundaries, your relatives still have a right over you. And there are ways to navigate it where you are able to have that balance. So again, in standing up for our principles, we don't, it's not a green light to be disrespectful. Don't be overzealous, and ground yourself in that knowledge. So let's go over a few different examples and how to navigate through them, right? So first, let's quickly define the idea of self-differentiation. And self-differentiation is the ability to be able to remain calm and clear-headed in the face of disagreements with others, conflict, criticism, right? So you're not emotionally reactive. And why this is relevant in this time is because, especially with everything going on overseas, right? I don't want to jump too much into a tangent. We tend to jump from one bandwagon to the other without grounding ourselves in what our deen says, right? So, we speak up against oppression, but we don't lose our manners in the process, right? We don't, especially here in the West, subhanAllah, a lot of our eyes are opening up to the idea that, like, the Democratic candidates are not our savior, right? Where, at one point, some very well-intended Muslims would hold on to that idea of, like, no, we need to, vote for so-and-so candidate because they're going to save Islam. No, Allah is the one protecting Islam, right? And so now when they see that their mouths muted over the issue of Palestine, they start to realize, oh, subhanAllah, right? These people who we were pushing really don't care about us. So a person who's well differentiated is able to have that balanced thinking and to be able to navigate these difficult situations without becoming emotionally reactive. So let's give first a very, very simple example. Let's give the example of a parent and a child. So what happens when your child is insisting on doing something haram? And may Allah protect us. One of the things, especially in the West, I'm not sure how prominent this is overseas. I wouldn't be surprised if it is now, is the whole LGBTQ issue, right? And we have our principles, but we're still respectful. So what happens if your child, is very pro towards that agenda? Right? How do we keep that balance? You know, we have to give the message that, look, we don't have to agree with each other, but I also love you too much to compromise your akhirah. I remember when I was working in the hospital, I used to specialize in addiction and addiction medicine. And we would have I would get a lot of disgruntled patients who would be so upset when, when they relapsed, or they wanted to relapse, or if, I would have to, like, report them if they ended up relapsing on whatever drug. And they would get so mad. And my response to them was that, listen, man, I care about you, and I actually genuinely care about your well-being, right? And so because of that, I'm not going to compromise my level of care for you, right? I want to give you the best level of care. As parents, we want to, whether our children like us at that moment or not, we have a responsibility. We do it with hikmah, but we want to convey to them, I love you so much and I care about you so much that I'm not going to compromise something that I know is going to hurt your akhirah, right? So setting that boundary in this situation where your child insists on sinning, whether it's it's easier when they're younger, but especially when as they become like adults, right? You can't force them, but you can still hold your principle while keeping that relationship, right? You might have to say, look, I'm okay talking about other stuff, but I can't talk about this because again, it's going to compromise my beliefs. It doesn't mean I love you any less, but this actually, in fact, means I love you so much because everybody else around you might be saying, yes, go for it, even if they disagree with it. I'm the one who is risking you not liking me, but telling you the truth, right? So that's the example of a parent and child. What about the other way around? How do we, as um, like, how do we deal with our parents if they insist on us doing something haram? So for example, like our parents saying that, oh, you're too strict. Like why aren't you going to this wedding? And you know that this wedding has many haram components, right? Find that balance, right? I think one of the things that we struggle with a lot psychologically, especially people who are very religiously leaning, is this idea of like اتباع الوالدين وبر الوالدين. توجد فرق بين اتباع الوالدين وبر الوالدين. There's a difference between um, obeying your parents versus showing like goodness and kindness to your parents, right? So Islam doesn't say you have to obey your parents, but it is very insistent on the idea of being respectful to your parents, right? If I tell people that if Islam said that you have to obey your parents, then we maybe wouldn't have Islam because many parents of the companions wanted them to revert back to shirk, right? So they stood their ground, but they were respectful. They were respectful, and that's the balance, right? So um, if your parents are insisting on something like that's haram, you find a way to deal with it, navigate through it with hikmah. If, for example, you're on the phone with your mother or your father, and they're insisting on like backbiting about another relative, right? You're not going to say, astaghfirullah, you just ate, the flesh of your dead brother, and don't you know what this ayah says? And that's not going to work with your parents, and you're crossing certain bounds if you have a certain tone with your parents. However, you can explain to them that, listen, like, I know you might not realize it, but I think we're falling into backbiting. And if they still insist, because oftentimes people will still insist and say, no, no, I'm not, I'm just saying the truth, and that is what backbiting is. Well, like, if they insist, you change the topic. So anyway, like, what'd you have for dinner today? Right? If that doesn't work, um, you can use something, and I encourage people to use this very sparingly, right? It's known as the gray rock method. It's often used when dealing with narcissists and narcissistic personality disorder. But the gray rock method is that when you are having to stay in contact with somebody who is maybe harmful to your emotional well-being, possibly to your deen, how do you how do you keep that relationship while keeping your sanity? So one of the things known as the gray rock method. And I remember doing this with one of my relatives who I do love very much, but like they had fallen into kind of this sin of like backbiting and like and there's just a lot of negativity. And I stopped the conversation and I was like, okay, let me use the gray rock method. The gray rock method is where you become as boring as a gray rock, right? And so I started talking about how I cooked a lunch for my son that day. And I said, oh, and I was boiling the potatoes and I was trying to figure out what's the right temperature to boil the potatoes. And I went on for 10 minutes talking about how to boil potatoes, right? By the end of that conversation, um, my relative had said to me, okay, and this is someone who would always pick on me for not calling enough, and so she said that, okay, okay, beta, like, but I have to get going. It was really nice talking to you, right? I wasn't rude. I set a certain boundary. I stopped the conversation, and I was able to get her off the phone in a healthy way by literally talking about boiling potatoes, right? So that's the gray rock method. Um, Another situation that we often see in family therapy is something known as triangulation, right? And I'll go over that really quickly because I just have like 1 or 2 minutes left. So triangulation is where you might get dragged into, let's say, a fight that your parents are having, and this happens sometimes with our adult parents as well. Um, is where if they have a disagreement, they'll drag you in. They'll say, "Do you know what your mom said? Do you know what your dad said? I can't believe they said that." And what happens is, let's suppose that a mother and father are not getting along and they have a strained relationship. And so what they tend to do is they'll tend to gravitate towards one child, and that child will almost, take place of the spouse. So that child is going to be the one who fulfills all the emotional needs of the parent, right? So let's suppose a mom is not getting along with her husband. And so she starts to confide in her eldest son. And so she keeps sharing, keeps sharing, keeps sharing. And now the son is in a position where it's like, listen, I don't want to hear bad about my father, right? I don't want to keep hearing about it. But at the same time, I know I want to keep a relationship with my mom. So what do I do? And this is where you have to learn how to detriangulate. So take yourself out of the situation. Mom, I love you. I understand it can be frustrating that dad behaved this way. I really think you should talk to him about it. No, no, I can't talk to him about it. Nobody understands. Like, okay, I understand, but like it's difficult for me to hear this, and I love you both, and I don't want to feel like I have to pick sides. So I really, really want to encourage you to talk to him. And then you start setting the conversation with anything else except for dad. You keep switching the topic until eventually that person is forced to start to react, start to interact with their husband, right? Your mom is forced to start to interact with your dad. And that's called detriangulation. So when your parents drag you into this type of situation, and it could be parents, it could be siblings, it could be friends, right? Where you are kind of the emotional um, dumpster, for lack of better words, right? How do you set that boundary where you are trying to please Allah but not by not hearing backbiting, especially about your parents, right? If one parent is backbiting the other, nobody wants to be in the middle of that. But you also want to do it in a respectful manner where you're not hurting your parents' feelings. And you're gonna have to realize that you're not gonna be able to please everyone all the time. The priority is always pleasing Allah. But again, going back to using it with hikmah. Yeah, somebody commented that like, yeah, you become unfortunately your parents' punching bag. May Allah make it easy, and those are times where we have to go back and realize, okay, Islam doesn't ask us to obey our parents blindly. I have to be respectful. How can I respectfully set certain boundaries? Right? How can I respectfully set certain boundaries? Um, the last example that I wanted to give, but it's I know we have like a minute left, or I think I might be over time, is a more serious example. And so this is something that probably requires a completely other topic. But what happens in scenarios, and I get this a lot, where dealing with a husband and wife, where the wife is not intimate with the husband. And so now the husband throws the, ayat and hadith about, like like about the person being cursed and so on. And so now you're in a difficult situation because you want to please Allah, but at the same time you want to be you want to be aware of your emotions and your emotional state and how you're feeling. That's not an easy situation, right? And that's I would just say that this highlights the need for our communities to have obviously Islamically centered sex education, right? Because when it comes to intimacy, it's about communication, it's about respect, it's about sharing likes, likes, dislikes, and so on. And this was the methodology of the Prophet ﷺ, where he taught us to speak about these things in a, of course, respectful manner, but to communicate that with our spouses, right? So, this is an issue where it's nuanced. It's not so easy to navigate through, but that's another example of where we fall into this area of like, okay, but I want to do what's pleasing to Allah, but at the same time, how do I navigate through this? Um, those are the examples that I gave, right? So if anyone wants to reference, his name is Dr. Murray Bowen, Bowen. The book is called Family Evaluation. So it's a textbook in grad school, so it might be a boring read for some, but I think some of his ideas are very relevant. Some are not. Whatever we study in psychology, from the Western world, we always look at it through our Islamic lens to get the clearest understanding. So I want to close with this, inshallah. We want to strike that balance, especially as we're going into Ramadan. But we want to make sure that we don't have grudges with those family members either. Somebody who is well differentiated is somebody who can set those boundaries without making a big deal out of it, right? I'm sorry, I'm not going to go to that wedding, but you know what? Like, I will still, come over to your house, or I will go to that, that couple's house or that family's house later and drop off a gift or something. So I'm going to have that balance, and I'm not going to feel bad about if other people make me feel bad about following my deen, right? But nor am I going to, insult them or anything like that. We're living in a time when, subhanAllah, so many people are losing their loved ones, and we're seeing it live streamed, right? We're seeing it live streamed where parents are burying their children, where husbands are burying their wives, where wives are burying their husbands, where children are burying their parents. May Allah ease the difficulties and just the atrocities that are going on in Rafah and Gaza and our brothers and sisters in Palestine all around the world. But this is hopefully a wake-up call for us to learn to love our family more, learn to appreciate them more, even in disagreements. Be balanced and smart in the way that you deal with your loved ones, but appreciate them, because even through all the disagreements, I can guarantee you that those who lost their loved ones would do anything to have them back, right? So we are living in a time where we really, really need to step up the appreciation of our loved ones, because we're seeing death all around us. May Allah protect us all. Allow us to strike that balance between huquq Allah wa huquq al-Ibaad, between obedience to Allah and giving rights of Allah and giving rights to Allah's creation. Jazakumullah khair. I don't know if we have any times for questions and answers, but I have like 2 or 3 minutes if anyone has any questions.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Usman. You just stated that you have 3 minutes, correct?
Yeah, literally 3 minutes. Yeah, I have to head to the
Okay,
office.
wonderful. Oh, no
It's 7 in
problem.
the morning here. So
Yes, yes, here. Okay, brothers and sisters, if there is any questions, we would have to limit it, unfortunately, due to a manner of the time. But please write your questions on the chat, and I will read that for you.
وفيكم بارك. Yes, correct. Yeah, Family Evaluation by Murray Bowen. That's correct. Yeah. How do I reconnect with manipulative family members? Right. So okay, we'll stick to somebody's asking about phone addiction. That's a different topic. So, how do I reconnect with manipulative family members? Right. So, I think again, if you feel the person has, and I don't like to throw this word around too much, but if you feel the person has narcissistic tendencies and really they tend to bring you down, um, control the topic of conversation to the best you can and how often you communicate with them. So, for me, sometimes with certain family members that I know might upset my mood and really throw my day off, I would never pick up their phone ever. However, I would make it a point every single time to call them. Typically, I'd call them on the way to my office, right? And so, if the conversation even remotely started to get toxic in any way, I would say, okay, Barakallahu Fik, I'm so sorry, I'm at work, or I'm about to head to work. I'm almost at the office. Inshallah, we'll talk later. And then when they would call, I wouldn't pick up, but I would, I would go and out of my way to call them and ask about how they're doing and so on, right? Again, going back to that gray rock method with making sure that you're the one who controls the topic, and it could be boring topics, right? If in order to avoid like backbiting and these type of things, trying to control the narrative the best you can and keeping your calm and cool. And may Allah make it easy. Understand that when you are trying to have Silat Rahim and you're dealing with difficult family members, um, this is an act of worship as well. You're trying to follow the prophetic commandment of uniting family ties while at the same time keeping your sanity. Inshallah. Okay, somebody asked about, can you ask more, answer more about Peaceful You? Peaceful You Counseling is, we're a clinic in, located in Dallas, Texas. I do speak to people online, so I have, spoken to people overseas and so on. You can email me. It's Usman, USMAN, at peaceful, PEACEFULYOU.org, peacefulyou.org. I'll just put this down here. Okay. That's usually the best way to reach me. You can also find me on Instagram, Usman.Mughni, Mughni. Yes. Okay.
Wonderful.
So there's a lot of Islamic questions, but I don't have time to answer all of them. So inshallah,
Yeah.
barakallahu feekum. I'm so sorry. I wish I had more time, inshallah, but I have to head to the office. I have a client in a few minutes. So barakallahu
Thank
feekum,
you.
but hopefully beneficial manner.